On the last episode of Podcraft, Colin and I both agreed that podcast sponsorship is broadly overrated for the average indie podcaster. And that is mostly true, but it must be said, sponsorship does have its place. It's often not the best way for independent creators to make money, but for some shows it could still be the right fit. There's plenty of reasons why you might not want to ask your listeners for direct financial support through something like Patreon. You might not want to run a membership, you might not want to create your own products or services, and in some cases the topic of the show itself makes sponsorship feel more natural. If you're already talking about tools, products or services that you use and genuinely rate, then it's reasonable to ask whether that work could help support the show financially. That's not selling out, it's not stuffing the podcast with irrelevant ads. It could be a straightforward way to support your work without alienating the audience you've spent years building. The problem is that identifying potential sponsors is the easy part, and you don't exactly need to have detective level skills to find a way to reach out to most companies. The big hurdle is that if you're an indie creator with an audio first show and a numerically small but highly engaged audience, the person reading your pitch is almost certainly living in the world of scrolls, feeds and quick clicks. They're used to metrics like views, impressions and follower counts, basically numbers that you can glance at and compare. But audio doesn't behave like that. And if you try to sell an audio first podcast as if it does, you're always going to look small. Audio doesn't behave like feeds because it's not built around interruption. People don't half listen to a podcast while scrolling past something else. They choose it. They put headphones on, they listen whilst they're walking, working out, washing up or driving. They sit with the same voice, often for 40 minutes or more. That's not how views work, that's not how impressions work. But if you send a sponsor a pitch that leads with a small listener number, you invite them to judge your show using the only model they know, and by that standard, you're always going to lose. So the first thing you have to do when selling an audio first podcast is change the frame. Stop selling reach and start selling attention. Attention's the one thing that feeds are very bad at measuring. A view might last 2 seconds, an impression might not be seen at all, a follower might never actually consume anything you make. Audio is the opposite. Listening takes time, it takes intention, it usually happens alone, and once someone has built a habit around a podcast, they tend to stick with it. That's the value you're offering, but you have to explain it because most sponsors, most marketing departments, they're not trained to see this. This is why I reckon we need to rethink the classic podcast media kit in 2026. I've made plenty of them myself over the years, usually a PDF full of numbers, charts and a rate card at the end. PDFs are easy to send and they can be really well designed and visually pleasing, but they're also often quickly skimmed and they tend to lock your show into a single snapshot in time. For an audio first podcast, I think it's the wrong way to communicate value. Audio needs explanation, it needs framing, it needs space to show how listening actually works. A living document works better for that, something like a Notion page or a shared Google Doc that you could update regularly. The point isn't really how it looks, but that it stays current and gives you room to explain things properly. You could show how attention builds over time, you could add context around listening behaviour, you could update numbers without reissuing a new document every few months. A static media kit tends to flatten everything into a comparison that you don't want. It turns years of listening into a single line item. 500 listens looks small when you treat it like 500 impressions. It looks very different when you treat it as 500 people giving you 40 minutes of their time week after week. Those are not the same thing. There's one very practical knock-on effect of all this, and it's worth spelling out. If your value needs explanation, then leading with prices is usually the wrong move. When you open with rates, you invite the exact comparison you're trying to avoid. Someone's going to immediately divide your price by your listener numbers and judge it using feed-style logic, and that's rarely a fair fight. A better approach is to ask for a conversation first, not a pitch deck, not a rate card, just a short conversation about fit. So who their product is for, what they're trying to achieve, and whether your audience actually makes sense for them. Once that's clear, the numbers and the costs have context, but without it, they're just numbers on a page. This isn't about being evasive or awkward around money, it's about sequencing the conversation properly. Fit first, then structure, then cost. If your show's niche, this matters even more. In specialist hobbies, professional fields and enthusiast communities, people don't buy on impulse. They buy after hearing something a few times, after it feels familiar, after it's recommended in a context that they trust, and by a person that they trust. That's you. A small audience that listens regularly usually outperforms a much larger audience that's only half paying attention. But again, that's not obvious unless you walk someone through it. So instead of leading with downloads, talk about time, talk about listening hours, talk about repeat behaviour, talk about how listeners don't just join in for new episodes, but they go on to binge your entire back catalogue. Those details do more work than any headline number. This is all on my mind at the moment because I'm working on a new media kit for my own hobby podcast, and looking at that podcast analytics, I could take the total number of downloads and spread them across all episodes where it will work out at an average of about 500 per episode. That's a solid number, I know that, but most companies are used to supporting YouTube channels that appear to have 10 or even 100 times that audience. So instead I'm going to look at listen time. Using data from Apple and Spotify, which together accounts for the majority of podcast listening, the show has generated just over 23,800 hours of listening. On its own, that number's really abstract, but it becomes meaningful when framed properly. So that amount of listen time equals almost 1,000 full days, more than 140 weeks, more than 32 months, and well on the way to 3 full years of attention. Those are numbers people could picture, and once they could picture them, they tend to take the show more seriously. There's also something else worth mentioning, if it applies, and that's longevity. Most podcasts stop, most don't make it past a year, some don't even hit double figures. So if your show's been running consistently for several years, that's a signal. It tells sponsors that you're not a short-term experiment and you're not a risky bet. Again, this isn't about showing off, it's just about reducing uncertainty. So if you're trying to sell an audio-first indie podcast in a scrolling world, the shift is fairly simple. Don't borrow the language of feeds, don't compete on a scale that you don't have, and don't let other platforms define your value. Sell time, sell attention, and sell trust. That's what audio actually does best. I'm not saying sponsorship is something every indie podcaster should chase. For a lot of shows, asking listeners for direct support or building something of your own is going to make more sense and pay off more reliably. But if you do decide that sponsorship is right for your show, especially if you're audio first and niche, then you need to sell it on your own terms. That means being clear about what you're offering and equally clear about what you're not. So you're not offering mass reach or virality or a scrolling audience. What you're offering instead is time and room and nuance. You're offering repeat listening and you're offering trust built slowly over years. For the right sponsor in the right niche, that's not a weakness, it's the entire point. If more indie podcasters understood that, few of them would feel that sponsorship only works for people with big numbers and louder platforms. So if your podcast centres around a specialist hobby, professional field or enthusiast community, there is a decent chance sponsorship could work well for you. It'll just work differently than the type of sponsorship you're used to hearing about. Alright, I hope that's been useful and I appreciate you listening to this episode of Podcraft. If you'd like to work with myself and Colin directly for help with any aspect of your show, then you could reach out at thepodcasthost.com/help. And please be sure to check out Alitu, the quickest and easiest podcast editing tool on the market, which helps support all the work we do and gives you one brilliant all-in-one platform to record, produce and publish your show. You can try it free today at alitu.com, that's ALITU.com.